Hi everyone, this is our last poetry video, to help you prepare for the skill practice prompt repetition of sound. We have the two poems to look at today, Caedmon and the Displaced of Capital. We won't be doing as in-depth of an analysis as we have with some of the other poems, but we will be looking at their sound devices and imitating what we see in those poems in our own writing. Sound is a deep and complex topic in poetry, and we're just going to get the very basics of it today. Later on in the quarter, when we start answering the question for the final prompt, how does a poet make meaning, and we start looking at how sound makes meaning, then we'll get into the deeper, more complex and sophisticated discussions of sound then. I might touch on a few ways today that the poet is using sound to make meaning, but it will only be briefly touched on. So we're going to start by looking at different ways to enhance and emphasize the sound of your writing. What the sounds of your words by themselves and then taken together can do for your writing, and why you want to pay attention to the way that your language sounds and what it could do for your reader. So let me go over to our document here. And we're going to do some introduction, just give you some definitions to understand sound devices, and then some examples as well before we look more closely at the poems. So before we get into the sound devices, I have a couple of epigraphs for you to kind of set the theme of the day. The theme is to please your reader, to keep them interested. And we'll talk about what that means as we go. The first one is by a poet, Horace. He said, "Stroke your reader's cheek as you box his ears." As we know from our discussion of word choice to establish tone, these words stroke and then box create an interesting comparison. One of them is a little aggressive in its tone, where the other is gentle in its tone. This quote is emphasizing this idea of the sound of language can be pleasing, even though it might seem aggressive or overwhelming. We have another epigraph from Mary Poppins, if you're familiar with this. She says, "A spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down." The basic concept here is that when people have to ingest or digest something difficult or something that doesn't taste good, we can add a little bit of sugar or something that tastes good to help the process. So it's balancing out again this pleasant feeling with a less than pleasant feeling. And we see that one last time in this final quote that's talking about both pain and pleasure. The poet Mark Strand says, "How do you turn pain into its own memorial? How do you write it down, turning it into itself as witnessed through pleasure, so it can be known, even loved?" This gets more to a central concept of poetry outside of just this idea of sound, but sound is incorporated in it, of course. And this is this idea that we can write about painful experiences, but through the form and the techniques of poetry, we can make them pleasurable, as if they were songs to be enjoyed and loved, even though the subject matter might be difficult. So that kind of sets the stage for today, and probably even sets the stage for a discussion of Anne Winter's The Displaced of Capital. So we're going to look at 4 sound devices. You have heard of some of these before, at least the first one. These are the 4 sound devices that you are going to practice in your last description. Again, I want to emphasize that your skill practice descriptions, your style portfolio descriptions, they need to be concrete, zoomed in, physical detail as we started from the beginning. Now you're just adding on to it an attention to the language or the sound of your language as you write. So Let's start with alliteration. Here's the definition and then an example. Alliteration, as you may know, is the repetition of a vowel or consonant at the beginning of words in a series. We've probably heard the exaggerated version of alliteration with anything like Peter Piper picked a pickle or whatever that is, or Sandy sells seashells by the shore, where it's overemphasizing the repetition of that first letter. But we're going to look at examples that are a little bit more subtle than that, but still represent this repetition. And so I took this example from Denise Levertoff's Caedmon. Near the end of the poem, she says, "Until the sudden angel affrighted me, light effacing my feeble beam, a forest of torches, feathers of flame, sparks up flying." You probably notice the repetition of the F in this description, and we're going to look specifically at the F's at the beginning of the word. So we have feeble, forest, feathers, flame. This is a perfect example of alliteration. Not every word in the phrase starts with the same letter, but a number of them do. There's no real rule for alliteration other than you don't want to overdo it. Have every word start with the same, because then it begins to sound childish. But here we have a nice feeble forest, feathers, flame. This is, of course, emphasized by the other F's that we have in flying, affrighted, and effacing. But technically, it is the repetition of F at the beginning of the words that is the alliteration here. Let's move on to the next skill, assonance. This is the repetition of a vowel sound within words in a series. So in alliteration, we were looking at the beginning of the word. Here we're going to look at sounds within the middle of the word, which means anything but the beginning. So it could be middle or ending of the word, wherever that sound gets repeated. And so we have from the Displaced of Capital a line of description that says, "As I pass down Broadway this misty late winter morning, the city is ever alluring." Vowel sounds A, E, I, O, and U. The one we see most common here is the I. This mist late winter city. Oops. I don't know what I just did. Hold on one second. City is. Now we also have the morning and the alluring. It's that I there. It's a different I sound. It doesn't sound the same as the we, me, the, se. It is a high-pitched I sound instead of a low-pitched. So we see this I in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words within this description. And we call this assonance. Now assonance is much more subtle than alliteration. This one jumps out to us with feeble, forest, feathers, and flame. And this one is a little bit trickier. It's maybe less noticed by, it's less registered by our minds as a reader, even though our ear notices it. And so part of learning to pay attention to the language is just pay closer attention to what your ear is noticing. I'll come back to this example in a minute because it also has some other of the sound devices in it, but we just looked at this for assonance. Consonance is the repetition of a consonant sound within words in a series. So basically, same concept as assonance, but it's just with a consonant sound, so all other letters that are not vowels. And from, let's see, this is from the Caedmon poem, and Denise Levertoft's speaker says, "I'd see by a twist of lit rushes the motes of gold moving from shadow to shadow, slow in the wake of deep, untroubled sighs." We probably have a couple instances of consonants here. I'm going to focus first on the T. Twist, lit, motes, and untroubled. There also is, let's see, this D, shadow, shadow, untroubled with eyed, but mainly, in gold. So we see these D's and these T's. And that's examples of consonants. I chose this example because of the distance that this last T is away from this first phrase. In general, as the description keeps going, maybe sometimes the repetition of the sound will be more spaced out, but at least you have a first sequence of description that has this consonance very obvious, and then anything that comes after it will be reminiscent of that first phrase. So that's consonants. As I said in this example here, there's definitely some consonants here as well. Even in this small phrase, we have misty late winter. So we have the repetition of the T 3 times in that small little phrase. And the point of this is to see that these sound devices happen together, that you can have both assonance and consonants happening together. Each individual reader will respond differently. Maybe I will read this description and I'll hear the I more than anything. Maybe one of you reads it and you hear the T more than anything. That is just natural. As we pay more and more attention to the language of the writing, we'll see all of it happening at once. The last thing we're going to practice and look for in the poems for reading is what I'll call syllabic emphasis. And so basically what this means is looking for the repetition of polysyllabic words in a phrase or series of phrases. By polysyllabic, I mean many syllables. And I think what I'm referring to here in the example shows this is any words that have more than 2 syllables. So 1 and 2 syllable words are fairly common. As you get into the 3 and 4 and 5 syllable words, they call more attention to themselves, especially when you put a number of polysyllabic words together in a phrase. So here from Displaced of Capital, starting with this phrase, we have quite a bit of syllabic emphasis. We have tar paper favelas. Each of those has 3 syllables per word. Planetary barracks. That is a 3 syllable and a 2 syllable word. Paperless migrants, also a 3 syllable and then 2 syllable word. We have obsolescent, that's 4 syllables in it. And then altiplano also has 3. So this phrase, or this series of phrases, this description from Ann Winter's Displaced of Capital, uses language that almost seems like you're chewing as you say it out loud. Tar paper favelas, planetary barracks with steep rents for paperless migrants so that they remit less to those obsolescent, starving relatives on the altiplano. I almost lose my breath a little bit. My mouth is having to do a lot. And not only is that affecting me as I read it, but it's affecting me as I listen to it because of how much the language is emphasized with the syllables. So we're going to pay attention to where we can use language like this to call attention. All these cases do a good job at basically creating pleasure for the ear. It notices repetition. So repetition is both pleasing to our mind, it calls attention to something, it emphasizes an idea, but also the repetition of sound is pleasing to our ear and our emotions. That's why we listen to music, and poetry does the same thing and has the same effect as music. It's almost like chords of a song or chords of a melody that is something that's repeated. There's some sort of pattern, and it is pleasing to us as readers to hear or listeners to hear. So that's the 4 skills that you're going to practice in your last description. And you've seen a couple examples of these working in the 2 poems we read so far. But let's read maybe through these poems and talk about them a little bit more in depth. I feel like because we're talking about sound, I will read the poems so you can hear them being read and hear the language of them. And maybe we won't talk too much in depth, but we'll just let those sound devices soak in. So Denise Levertoft's poem is Caedmon. All others talked as if talk were a dance. Clodhopper I with clumsy feet would break the gliding ring. Early I learned to hunch myself close by the door. Then when the talk began, I'd wipe my mouth and wend unnoticed back to the barn to be with the warm beasts, dumb among body sounds of the simple ones. I'd see by a twist of lit rush the motes of gold moving from shadow to shadow, slow in the wake of deep untroubled sighs. The cows munched or stirred or were still. I was at home and lonely, both in good measure, until the sudden angel affrighted me, light effacing my feeble beam, a forest of torches, feathers of flame, sparks upflying. But the cows, as before, were calm, and nothing was burning, nothing but I, as the hand of fire touched my lips and scorched my tongue and pulled my voice into the ring of the dance. So not only does the language in this poem, the repetition of sound, create quite a bit of pleasure, almost like it's a song that's playing for us. Sound does something in addition to pleasing. It actually creates meaning and or imitates meaning in a poem. And this is something we'll get into later on in the quarter, but I just want to call attention to a few things here. We're going to look at depth later about how certain sounds, let's talk about the K or the C sound here at the beginning of the poem. And I'm going to highlight a couple things. Talked, as if talk, or a dance clodhopper, clumsy, and break. There's even more if we keep going, like clothes and such, but this is enough to make the point I'm trying to make today. Certain of the sounds in our alphabet have emotional effects and or tone effects, that they have a certain attitude based on the way they're said in our mouth and the way that they create sound in the air. And the K and the C in our alphabet are known as mutes or stops. It's a category it's one of the many categories that our alphabet is broken down into. And mutes or stops have this kind of harsh friction effect where almost they like stop and they get all the emphasis of the word. It almost sounds, if you can hear this on my desk, like a little bit of a hammer hitting a desk or a fist hitting a desk. So it has this roughness to it. Now what's interesting here is that the description by the speaker of themselves is a description of them being very clumsy, of them being not polished in their speech, of them being rough in their speech. And the language here, with the repetition of the C and the K, is imitating that roughness. We see that again in, let's see, in the middle of the poem here. Another category is the P and the B category. It doesn't have a specific name, but P's and B's often indicate a feeling of kind of disgust because you kind of have to push the air out of your mouth when you say it, and they carry with it this distasteful quality to them. So we have began, wipe, back, barn, bee, beast, dumb, body, simple. And we have this repetition of the P and the B in this section, which is again mimicking that kind of um, almost feeling of shame that the speaker has when they leave the party to go be by themselves with the animals because they are too scared to speak out in front of someone else. They're almost disgusted. He's almost disgusted with himself, and that's represented again in the sound that's being emphasized. So, um, this poem, if you didn't pick up on it, is basically a story of someone who isn't talented in singing songs and or talking eloquently in a group of friends. And so they always leave the party when this idea of talking or singing begins. But the end of the poem reveals that um, the speaker is visited by an angel who gives him the gift of being able to speak eloquently. Um, so that's the story of the poem. And we see a little bit how the repetition of certain sounds is imitating the content of the poem or the feeling of the poem. So that's one thing that sound does for us on a deeper level than just creating pleasure. The other thing that sound does, um, in addition to creating pleasure, is creating pleasure to offset the maybe distasteful quality of some of the content. And so here in the Displaced of Capital, we have a poem that is almost, it's an argument about the economy. It's an argument about immigration. It's an argument about poverty and global problems. And so this is a pretty serious subject. It's not like some of the subjects we've read so far in the poems. William Butler Yeats talking about his Lake Island of Innisfree, and James Wright talking about laying on a hammock at a farm. Those are all very peaceful, and they're almost poems of praise. This poem isn't really a poem of praise. It's a poem that's thinking about and trying to deal with very difficult subject matter. And we won't read the whole thing, and we won't talk about it too much in depth. The basic idea is that the speaker is learning to pay attention to the difficulty that surrounds her, even in the midst of not wanting to do so. She says, all I want, where does it say it? All I want this morning is to pass down my avenue, find a fresh printed Times and an outside table. She just wants to enjoy her day, but she cannot ignore the difficulty that's going on around her. And that's maybe the main tension of this poem. She wants to just enjoy herself. She wants to enjoy her coffee. She wants to enjoy her reading, but she keeps seeing the poverty and the suffering of people around her. And that's the subject of the poem. So this poem does reveal quite a bit of attention to repetition of sound as a way to please the reader's ear as they read this poem and think about the difficult subject matter. It's almost like balancing out. If this was just difficult subject matter about how poor the world is and how messed up the world is, it would just be a newspaper article. It would be like the news articles we read every day and say, wow, there's no good news in the world. It's all bad news. But here, it's given a different tone, and the tone comes from the pleasure that the sound creates and from the music of the writing. So we're more likely to pay attention, to think about this problem in new ways instead of just be overwhelmed by the difficult content. That's, I think, going to be it for this video. You don't need to worry about those deeper levels of what certain letters mimic emotionally. We'll get to that later. But what you do want to pay attention to in your writing assignment is using those 4 sound devices to create a sense of pleasure and almost music to your writing. Make sure you don't overdo alliteration. Repetition of sound does not mean rhyme as well. So avoid rhyme as well. And see what you can do with the subtlety of those consonants and assonants in your description. And make sure that you're continuing to write with close detail of the physical senses. Good luck. I can't wait to read those. I'll see you soon.